This is Not a River by Argentinian author Selva Almada, translated spectacularly from the Spanish into English by Annie McDermott and published in the UK by Charco Press. When Charco sent me this book, I was elated. I love the works of Selva Almada. Charco were lucky enough to let me interview her a little while ago. I've read everything of hers that exists in English, and this book kind of rounds out a trilogy-ish. Not a River is the third and final installment in a thematically led trilogy that began with The Wind That Lays Waste, translated by Chris Andrews, which is one of my favourite novels of all time, full stop, and was followed up by Brickmakers, also translated by Annie McDermott. These three novels have nothing to do with each other in terms of their plot or their characters. They are tied together as a trilogy by the fact that they are thematically all about masculinity in some way, and each of them tackles masculinity from a different perspective, a different angle. They are all short novels, they are all thought-provoking, they are all harsh, difficult reads, and they're all set in the most rural, rugged, natural areas of Argentina. Almada is an incredible Argentinian author, a wonderful feminist writer, and all three of these books are incredibly special. You can go track down my thoughts on the other two. I've got a written review of The Wind That Lays Waste and a video review of Brickmakers, and I also have a written review of her book Dead Girls, which is a whole other fascinating and difficult thing. Not a River is about 100 pages long, and it tells the story of two middle-aged men who take the son of their late friend out on a fishing trip in the wilds of Argentina. These three men were friends for a long, long time. One of them tragically died on their last fishing trip and has now been effectively replaced by his son. The novel opens with the three of them on a boat on a river, and one of them shoots a stingray with a gun 3 times. They fish it out and they string it up from a tree. It's a very raw and visceral way to open a novel. 3 men who go fishing with a pistol. And the act of shooting the ray doesn't feel like fishing. It feels like murder. It feels like a sin. And the imagery of them stringing it up conjures really, really dark things. It presents these men as violent rather than hunters or fishermen. They are doing something macabre, something wrong, something kind of tragic. And stringing it up, almost in a biblical sense, leads them down a pretty dark path that begins when a local man from an island on the river comes along, sees the strung up ray, and is offended by it. And immediately, these 3 guys are making an enemy of the locals. There is antagonism here. There are threats in the language that they share. This is bad immediately. And from here, things only get darker. The man that they've encountered has 2 nieces who are teenagers. Pretty young girls who eventually also come along themselves, and they invite the youngest of this group, who himself is also a teenager, to a party. And they say the party's just going to be out on the street nearby. Come along. They flirt with him, and the 2 older middle-aged men take too much time, too much space on the page, admiring these girls, eyeing them up, drinking them in, and it is very discomforting. All of this is painting a vivid picture of the environment, of the people in it, of who they are, of what they might be capable of their opinions on certain things, and there's so little language here. It's all painted very sparsely and simply and very clearly. As I said, this is only 100 pages long, and during that short time, we gradually move backwards into the past through flashbacks and memories. The book has no chapters, and it has very little punctuation as well. There are small breaks that create sub-chapters, and the only way you know if you're currently in the present or the past is whether or not it's currently being written in the past or present tense. And you have to focus on that. That is important, because as you're reading a book, you can easily forget what it's written in. We kind of take it for granted. I've put a book down before and thought, was that written in the past tense or the present tense? The first person or the third person? You can easily take these things for granted and just not notice, not pay attention, not consider it important, but it is here. And not only that, but we also move into the pasts of different people. The 2 middle-aged men especially. We learn about the boy's father, what happened to him, what his life was like, what fatherhood was like for him in the early days. We get a sense of what they were like when they were younger, when they were teenagers, when they were kids in a poor, rough, difficult neighborhood. And eventually, in the second half of the novel, we also flash back into the lives of these 2 girls. And there's something interesting there that we uncover as we go on. Something about these girls is off. This is, as I've said, a very short and sparse novel with not much dialogue, and it feels like it's not made up of much language, and that's weird to say because a book is just language. A novel is only words, but it feels like there aren't many words. Selva Almada and Annie McDermott, through her translation, have created a world of not very much. A world that is dense and difficult, a world that is harsh, a world that is uncomfortable, and a world that you can very vividly see in your mind's eye, and yet all of that is created with so few words. It's really incredible writing, a real mastery of language by both author and translator. Selva Almada knows how to create not only a world and a setting, but also a character or a group of characters, and thematically explores all of them with real depth and detail and thought and consideration. And yet so few words seem to be needed in order for her to accomplish that. And Annie McDermott, as a translator, also fully understands that, because all of this comes across in English as well. And without McDermott, that wouldn't be possible. There's a translator's note at the very back of the book, which I actually read first because I was curious about McDermott's process. I love Selva Almada, I love her works, I love her mind, and so I'm curious what it's like trying to translate her works. And McDermott said that Selva Almada is famous in Argentina for being difficult to read because she's from a very rural area and she uses very colloquial language. There are jokes about how people living in Buenos Aires have to have some kind of a dictionary with them at all times while they read her books, because even if you're from Argentina, you speak Spanish, you're going to have a hard time reading some of her works and some of the language that she uses. There are words that McDermott said she Googled while reading and nothing came up. Specifically, for example, in her notes she mentions a kind of owl that also looks like a wild cat. And there is a very colloquial rural name for this owl that Almada just uses in the book. McDermott Googled it and nothing comes up. Nothing in Spanish, English, or otherwise. And so she asked Almada, what is this thing? And Almada tried to explain it to her. It's literally a kind of owl that exists in rural Argentina, but also weirdly looks like a cat. And that is creepy and weird, and I love it. When I got to that moment in the novel, McDermott just says the name, just says the word that Almada uses, but through brilliant language just paints a picture of it perched on a tree branch, looking like a wild cat or something. It's really, really good. Rather than it looking visually like a cat, it is perched like one in a more metaphorical sense. Gorgeous translation, gorgeous writing. But here I kind of have to admit something about myself and my failings as a critic while reading this book. The previous two novels in this loose trilogy, I never struggled with reading and deconstructing them thematically. The Wind That Lays Waste is a book about religion on the surface. It's about a preacher and an atheist going head to head in a very small claustrophobic environment. It's a very waiting for Godot style of narrative where it feels like it would be perfect for the stage. You could easily put The Wind That Lays Waste on stage and it would work beautifully as a play. But it's not just about religion. It's about these two men and how they have two wards. The preacher has a daughter and the atheist mechanic has an apprentice, and these two are each influenced by the other man and drawn to his opinion as the book goes on. This is a book about patriarchy and the fact that men throw out their opinions and are so confident in them and no one stands up to them. When two very patriarchal men, a gruff misogynistic atheist mechanic and a preacher, go head to head, it is very much unstoppable force meets a movable object, and that book brilliantly explores the language of patriarchy and masculinity, the ways in which men think and express their thoughts and the difficulties in that and the tragedy of it. It's all laid bare and it's beautiful. Brickmakers is even more obvious. It begins at the end with two young boys bleeding to death. They have killed each other in a fight. And then we flash back to how we got here, and the book is all about inherited masculinity, inherited aggression and abuse, and the ways in which masculinity perpetuates violence and aggression, and men teach that to their sons. It's very obvious, it's very clear. Not a River is far more subtle and difficult, especially when it comes to the theme of masculinity. There is threat and danger and nervousness and apprehension and discomfort and unease. All of these things are there in black and white, but I've struggled to understand as I've read it and thought about it what all of it is for, what message Almada is trying to send here. So, if you've read the book or you're going to, please let me know your thoughts. What is she saying here about masculinity? I can see all of the damage it does in the book. I can see how these men are toxic and poisonous towards each other. I can see the violence of it all. I can see it in the imagery and in their actions and in their thoughts and their feelings. It's all laid bare. I see it, but I don't know the point of it. I don't know her message here. The previous two books each had a clear message. I understood that message very, very loudly. They were different messages, both about the toxicity of masculinity and patriarchy, and I got it, and I loved it. Here, I see it, but I can't feel it as much. It's difficult for me to explain, but I feel like I can't get that core message through. And I'm admitting that, and I want to understand it better, so let me know if you've read it and you have thoughts about the patriarchal, masculine message of the whole thing. But that aside, this is an astonishingly well-written book. It's a real tragedy. There is so much sorrow here, and it certainly paints a picture of the sorrow at the core of masculinity. It kind of reminds us that men are tragically sad things in their ability to not communicate, even on a very basic level. Communication by men often feels violent and aggressive. It's territorial. So much communication by men is territorial. There is competition in manhood and masculinity. And perhaps that's the point that the book is making. There is so much contest, competition, and territory here. Maybe that's the point. It's looking at the territorial and competitive nature of masculinity. I can certainly see that. If that's it, I'm satisfied. But Almada's books often feel like a warning to men. They seem to admit to men and encourage men to admit to themselves that manhood is kind of sad, and masculinity does damage to men as well. This is an important thing when it comes to feminism, is that when we talk about toxic masculinity, when we talk about patriarchy, when we talk about tearing all of that down, we're doing it for men's benefits as well. Because masculinity is inherently sad and tragic and screws men up as much as it screws up and endangers and damages women. Patriarchy and masculinity only serves the powerful. It doesn't serve your average man. Your average man can easily be doomed to sorrow and disappointment and tragedy. And I think that these books express that so fucking well. Almada's books speak to the tragedy of manhood, and they are remarkable in the ways in which they do that. I love her books so much. Not a River was an incredible way to begin 2024. So thank you to Charco Press. Thank you to Annie McDermott and Selva Almada. I am amazed, as always. Subscribe for books.